Welcome to Trending Faith. Thanks for joining us. Tim, I've got a question for you today. There are a lot of topics in the media now about social justice issues. As Christians, what is our role? How can we represent Christ when discussing these issues? Kind of a tough question.
Yeah, this is a lightning rod subject, and for good reason, I think. It's interesting, when I came to faith, I was a late teenager, and it was in the late 70s, and we'd been through the 60s as a country, and some that are viewing probably remember at least reading that in history books. But there was a lot of social engagement. And then the 80s and 90s rolled around, and the 2000s, and we've kind of gotten absorbed in our own little worlds, and now we live in our phones and our computers, and we're kind of, plugged in. But I wonder how many of us as believers are really aware and engaged in what's going on in our world. And there's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of things going on in our neighborhood, in our communities, in society in general that are reflections of the brokenness of society. Mm-hmm. And I think the church, God's people, need to be engaged in those things. And sometimes we feel safe and comfortable and warm and fuzzy in church, and we hear messages that we agree with, and we listen to music we like, and we're with people that are just like us. And we fail sometimes as God's people when we're in our little, collectives, that there are people that are just broken and hurting and feel betrayed by society and betrayed by the church and their neighborhood and government and everything. So I think there's a real need for God's people to feel a sense of responsibility, not just feel, but at least to begin with, to feel a sense of responsibility that I need to be engaged. I need to figure out what's going on in my world and why there's such angst about so many issues. And I mean, you can't turn on the TV and the news anyway, without seeing something that is disturbing about what's going on in society today. And I think it's right for Christians to be disturbed by that, and we should. Mm-hmm. And I think the temptation for us is to kind of wag our finger at society. We shouldn't do that, and we go back to our churches and we just hang out and do whatever we've done. And I think there's something to God's people feeling a sense of responsibility to be engaged in the issues of our day. And we've kind of gone off to our little hills to be a light on a faraway mountaintop and think that's okay, that's good enough. And, I'm kind of circling around this one point, but I think it's really important that we should sense this responsibility to be a difference maker in our world. So I just think it's a huge issue, and we need to be involved.
I like the way you're thinking about how we ought to respond, almost from the heart about these kinds of issues. And I think that sometimes when I don't feel that sort of I see something, I don't feel a response, an emotional response to it. I feel like there's a lack in me. There's a gap in what I ought to be about. And I worry because it seems like, and you've described a number of these areas, but it seems as though God's heart is very sensitive to some of these social issues. He's concerned about those who are hungry. He's concerned about those who are unclothed, those in jail. If you think of Matthew 25, he has a special place, it seems, in his heart for widows and orphans. And I just worry, what is going on in me when I don't respond? I think the church really needs to be centered on the gospel in that respect, worrying about whether the gospel has had that deep impact on our hearts so that we would respond appropriately like God does, have a heart after God. And in some ways, I think, and think about this with me or help me out here if you disagree, but I feel like sometimes when we engage society, we want to, you said, wag our finger, criticize, or be upset about whatever's going on out there. But it seems to me in many cases, we ought to remember that fundamentally the mission of the church is to make disciples. Sometimes those conversations start by giving a person a meal, offering a meal, sheltering them, doing something to help them. But when we really think about what it is that has changed us, that we would have a heart after God's own heart, Well, it's the gospel. It's the power of Christ. It's this transformation. And when we can bring that to an individual or a whole community that's hurting, underserved in some way, I think that can be powerful and transformational and perhaps more permanent than just offering a meal or a handout of some sort.
You know, yeah, just being engaged is just not enough. I mean, it's so important you bring it back to the gospel. I mean, how does the gospel, kind of rhetorical question, but how does the gospel come to bear on the conversation of the racial tensions that we're facing, the conversation around gender issues, the plight of those that are in poverty, and how those with wealth respond to that? How does the gospel come to bear on these issues of our day where people feel incredible frustration with what's being understood or being acknowledged or responded to about a variety of issues? And I think, you know, when we figure out how the gospel comes to bear on these topics and how we engage them, I think then the Christian now has a right focus, maybe a center on how we engage in this subject. It's a challenge. I think we need to figure out how to engage it with that kind of a center.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful. Great places to start. Thank you for that, Tim. Really appreciate it. And thank you for joining us.